She called the cops on me for parking on my own driveway. 6:47 a.m. Two patrol cars, lights flashing. My muddy F-250 sitting on my concrete pad, fully on my property. And Connie Riddell standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, wearing that smirk like she'd already won. When the officer stepped out, she pointed at me and said, "I pay your salary, arrest him." Right there, I knew. This wasn't about a truck blocking her view. This was about power, control, the kind of small-town tyranny that crushes good people every single day. But Connie made one mistake, one critical miscalculation. She had no idea I'm a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, 23 years dismantling threats a lot more dangerous than a suburban HOA dictator. So what would you have done? Drop your story below. I read every comment. And where are you watching from? Let's see who else is dealing with petty tyrants right now. Let me back up. My name is Vance Hartwick. Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army Intelligence, 23 years active duty. I'd just transitioned to reserve status, 1 weekend a month, keeping my hand in, and after 2 decades of living in base housing, moving every 18 months, sleeping in places where mortars were the alarm clock, I finally bought my first piece of real land. 4 acres in Pinewood Estates, Colorado. Trees, space, quiet. My wife Marlena, ICU nurse, tougher than half the soldiers I've commanded, was thrilled. Our son was at West Point, our daughter studying engineering at CU Boulder. This was supposed to be our chapter, the peaceful one. Every morning I'd pour black coffee from my stainless percolator, step onto the porch, and just listen. The crunch of frost on gravel under my boots, the smell of pine resin mixing with diesel exhaust from my truck. Cold air that didn't taste like sand or burning oil. It was perfect for about 8 weeks. Pinewood Estates is 47 homes tucked into the hills outside Colorado Springs, a mix of retirees and young families with a voluntary HOA. No legal teeth, just a handful of people who like organizing block parties and arguing about mailbox colors. And then there's Connie Riddell, 52, vice president of the HOA, married to Garrett, a real estate attorney who's never home, no kids. Lives in the biggest house on the corner lot with landscaping so perfect it looks like it was installed by a surgeon. Her lawn always smells like chemical fertilizer, sharp, acrid, the kind that burns your nostrils if you stand too close. And she does these evening patrols where she walks the neighborhood in heels that click on the asphalt like a countdown timer. Click, click, click. She's one of those people who uses the HOA like a personal fiefdom where everything's about property values and community standards. But if you listen close, you realize it's just code. She's made comments about transient renters. That's the Hispanic family 3 doors down. And she calls the veterans' work van parked on the street clutter. You get the picture. 2 weeks after we moved in, Connie knocked on my door with a welcome packet, smiled, shook my hand, then waited while I flipped through it. She'd highlighted one section in yellow. Vehicles over 6,000 pounds should be garaged or parked behind fence line. My truck is 6,400 pounds. I looked up and she was still smiling. Just a courtesy reminder, she said. We like to keep things tidy. I nodded, thanked her, closed the door. Marlena was watching from the kitchen. That woman's going to be a problem, she said. Maybe, I replied, but Marlena gave me that look, the one that says you're too optimistic and it's going to bite you. She was right. 12 weeks in, I came back from a weekend drill covered in mud after running field exercises. Live scenarios, zero sleep, the kind of training that keeps you sharp. And my truck looked like it had been through a war zone because, in a way, it had. I parked it on my driveway, my paved concrete apron 10 feet from the street, completely on my property, and planned to wash it that afternoon. Sunday morning, 7 a.m., Connie knocked. I opened the door mid-sip of coffee. That truck needs to be moved immediately, she said, pointing like it was a dead animal. It's an eyesore. I kept my voice level. It's on my property, ma'am. I'll wash it this afternoon. Her face went red, not pink red, and she said, "We'll see about that," then turned and walked away with her heels clicking double time. Marlena called from the kitchen. Told you. Monday morning, 6:45, I'm pouring my second coffee when I see the lights. 2 sheriff's patrol cars rolling up slow. And Connie, standing on the sidewalk, pointing at my truck like she's directing an airstrike. That's when this story really starts. The 2 deputies stepped out of their patrol cars, and I could see them doing the mental math before they even reached my porch. Young guys, professional, probably mid-30s. The taller one, nameplate read Kraus, spotted the military decal on my truck's rear window, then looked at me standing there in my Army PT shirt, and I watched his shoulders relax just a fraction. He walked up, polite but cautious, while his partner hung back by the vehicles. "Morning, sir," Kraus said. "We got a call about an illegally parked vehicle blocking access." He glanced at my truck, then at the wide-open street, then back at me with this look that said he already knew this was a waste of his time. "On my own driveway?" I said, keeping my tone even and friendly. Kraus sighed, pulled out his notepad, and walked over to check the property line, measured the distance from my truck to the street with his eyes, looked at the concrete pad, then turned to Connie, who was still standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed like a school principal, waiting for detention to start. "Ma'am, the vehicle is entirely on private property," Kraus called over. "There's no violation here." Connie's voice carried across the yard, sharp and indignant. "I want a report filed. He's violating covenant standards. This is a voluntary community and he's refusing to comply." Kraus walked back to me and I could see him fighting the urge to roll his eyes. "Sir, we're going to clear this as unfounded. Have a good day." He handed me a card with the incident number, nodded, and headed back to his car. As they pulled away, I felt that familiar sensation, the prickle of adrenaline at the base of my skull, the same feeling I'd get 30 seconds before a mission briefing when you know the intel's about to get complicated. That evening, my inbox pinged with an email from Dale Pemberton, the HOA president, 68, retired insurance adjuster, the kind of guy who'd apologize for winning a poker hand. Subject line: courtesy reminder vehicle placement. The body was pure corporate vagueness about community aesthetics and voluntary compliance, but Dale had CC'd the entire street, 18 households total. Marlena read it over my shoulder and said, "She's building a paper trail." She was right. So I replied to all, kept it short and factual, cited my property survey, noted there was no enforceable covenant according to county records, and attached a PDF of my plat map showing the property lines clear as day. The sound of Marlena's tea kettle whistling drifted in from the kitchen, and I could smell chamomile and honey mixing with the wood smoke from someone's fireplace down the street. And for a moment I let myself imagine this might be the end of it. It wasn't. Next morning I walked out to grab the newspaper and found an orange traffic cone sitting right at the edge of my driveway, not mine. I checked my security camera footage from overnight, and there it was. 11 p.m., a silver Lexus sedan pulled up, passenger door opened, Garrett Riddell stepped out, placed the cone, got back in, drove off. Took him 40 seconds. I picked up the cone, walked 3 houses down, and set it on Connie's pristine porch with a handwritten note underneath. "Believe you dropped this, V." Marlena saw me walking back and just shook her head. "You're poking the bear," she said. "Bear poked first," I replied. That afternoon, a county code enforcement truck pulled into my driveway and outstepped Raul Espinoza, mid-40s, wearing a county polo shirt, and the expression of a man who'd seen every stupid neighbor dispute known to mankind. "Mr. Hartwick, got a complaint about unpermitted grading work on your property? You do any earth moving recently?" I shook my head. "Bought it as is 8 months ago. Haven't touched the grading." Raul walked my property line, checked the drainage, looked at the slopes, then came back shaking his head. "Man, I'm sorry. This is the 5th bogus call I've gotten from this street this month alone. Somebody's got way too much time on their hands." I offered him coffee and we stood on the porch for 10 minutes while he vented, and that's when he gave me something I hadn't considered. "You know," Raul said, lowering his voice, "you can request your own property inspection report from the county for $15. Shows every complaint ever filed against your address going back years. I've seen guys in situations like yours use it to prove harassment patterns if things go sideways." He wrote down the department number on the back of his card. I remembered a contractor buddy from Fort Carson who dealt with a nightmare neighbor pulling the same stunt. Anonymous complaints, code enforcement visits, the whole 9 yards. And he'd gotten that report, taken it to a lawyer, and the harassment stopped cold within a week. I filed the request that same afternoon. $15 felt like the best money I'd spend all year. What I didn't know yet was how much worse things were about to get, or how useful that little piece of paper would become. 3 days later, I started noticing cars slowing down in front of my house, people I'd never met giving my property the once-over like they were casing it for a heist. Turned out Connie had been busy with a petition, Voluntary Covenant Enforcement Initiative, going door to door, collecting signatures and framing the whole thing as protecting property values in the neighborhood. She'd even pulled recent appraisal data showing a slight dip in home prices over the past quarter, conveniently blaming it on commercial vehicles and non-conforming property maintenance, which was code for my truck and the work van belonging to the veteran 2 streets over. By the end of the week, she had 11 signatures out of 47 homes, Mostly retirees who didn't know the details and just signed whatever Connie put in front of them while she smiled and talked about keeping the neighborhood beautiful. Then the anonymous letter showed up in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just a single sheet of printer paper with a message in Times New Roman. Military types think they're above the rules. Sell and move to base housing where you belong. Marlena found it when she got home from her hospital shift, and I watched her face go from confused to furious in about 3 seconds flat. I took the paper, held it up to the light, and caught the faintest scent of lavender. That distinctive, expensive hand lotion Connie wore everywhere. The kind that announces her presence 5 seconds before she enters a room. Marlena had mentioned it once after a block party, said it smelled like a funeral home, and now here it was, literally on a threat letter in my mailbox. I slipped it into a plastic sleeve and filed it in my growing folder of documentation right between the orange cone photos and the bogus code enforcement complaint. The following Tuesday, Marlena came home from her night shift at the ICU, shaking with a kind of anger I hadn't seen from her in years. Her car had gotten a parking ticket while she was working, parked legally on the street in a 2-hour zone that lifted restrictions after 6 p.m., but somehow she got cited anyway. She fought it, got it dismissed within 48 hours because it was obviously bogus, but the stress of dealing with it after a 12-hour shift where she'd lost 2 patients had left her exhausted. Then, 3 days later, her hospital received an anonymous phone call reporting that an ICU nurse on the night shift was showing up to work intoxicated, and the caller had described Marlena's shift time, her unit, even the color of her car in the parking lot. The hospital had to investigate. Mandatory policy, 0 tolerance. And even though Marlena was cleared within hours after a blood test and supervisor interviews, the humiliation of being pulled off the floor and questioned in front of her colleagues left her devastated. She came home that morning, still in her scrubs, and just stood in our kitchen with tears running down her face. "She went after my job, Vance," Marlena said quietly. "She called my hospital and tried to get me fired." I felt my jaw tighten in that way it does when I'm making decisions, and Marlena recognized the look immediately. She'd seen it before every deployment, every time I had to shift from husband mode into operator mode. "I need to make some calls," I said. Marlena just nodded, poured herself tea, and said, "Burn her down." I reached out to Captain Lynette Torrens, an old JAG buddy who'd helped me navigate a landlord dispute 2 years earlier when some clown tried to keep our entire security deposit because we'd hung pictures on the walls. Lynette picked up on the second ring, listened to the whole story without interrupting, then said, "Okay, first, your neighbor's an idiot. Second, if she's making false reports to your wife's employer, that's called tortious interference, and you could sue her into next Tuesday if you wanted." But Lynette's real advice was simpler. Document everything and create an official paper trail. File a harassment report with the sheriff, even if nothing comes of it right now, she said. Courts love timelines. If this woman escalates, you'll have dated evidence showing a pattern, and that's gold. I filed the report the next morning with Deputy Krause, same guy from the driveway call. And this time he took it seriously, made notes, asked good questions, told me they'd flag it in their system. Then Lynette mentioned something I'd never considered. HOAs registered as nonprofits have to make their financial records public in Colorado. Costs like $50 and takes 2 weeks. But I've seen cases where board members were using association funds like personal piggy banks. If there's funny money, that's your leverage. I submitted the request that same afternoon. $50 felt like the best investment I'd made since buying body armor before my first deployment. What I didn't know yet was just how messy Connie's books were going to turn out to be. 2 weeks later, Connie called an emergency HOA meeting and pressured Dale into sending out the notice with exactly 24 hours advance warning, which meant most people couldn't attend because they had work or plans they couldn't cancel on short notice. 19 neighbors showed up anyway, mostly out of curiosity because the agenda was vague as hell. Just said, "Discuss enforcement mechanisms," without any details. Connie had prepared a full slideshow, which she projected onto the community center wall using Dale's ancient laptop, and for the next 15 minutes we all sat there watching her click through photos of my truck from various angles. Close-ups of my survey stakes with their pink flagging tape, even shots of my security cameras mounted on the house. She argued for implementing voluntary fines of $100 per violation and hiring private security to patrol the neighborhood on weekends, which would have cost each household about $40 a month according to her spreadsheet. I was sitting in the back row, arms crossed, just watching her perform, and I'll admit there was a small part of me that was impressed by the sheer commitment to pettiness. This woman had compiled a 20-slide presentation complete with bar graphs about declining property values, all because she didn't like looking at my truck. About halfway through, Marcus Tillman raised his hand. He's a postal worker, early 50s, lives 4 houses down, and he'd always struck me as the kind of guy who sees through nonsense. "Connie," Marcus said, voice calm but firm, "this feels personal. His truck's parked on his own property." "Why do we care?" Connie's face went tight and she said, "Because people like him don't respect community standards." And the way she said "people like him" landed in the room like a grenade. The temperature dropped about 20 degrees. Several neighbors exchanged glances. Dale cleared his throat nervously and said, "Maybe we should table this discussion for another time, when we've had a chance to review the bylaws more carefully," which was his polite way of saying this meeting was a disaster. Connie glared at me as people started filing out, and she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "You think you're untouchable." I just smiled, nodded, and walked out into the parking lot where the smell of fresh asphalt and cut grass hung in the cool evening air. That night I sat at my kitchen table with Marlena and went through the HOA financial records that had arrived 3 days earlier. 18 months of expenses printed on cheap copy paper and stapled together in a packet that looked like it had been assembled by a high schooler. It didn't take long to spot the problems. Connie had been billing administrative expenses totaling $8,400 over 18 months. Receipts were vague as hell, just line items like office supplies, consulting fees, and community outreach materials. One entry jumped out immediately: $1,200 paid to Garrett's law firm for covenant review services, which is a fancy way of saying her husband billed the HOA to read documents he should have reviewed for free as a board member's spouse. I took photos of every page with my phone, and Marlena, who'd spent 15 years managing ICU budgets and knew how to spot financial irregularities, circled 3 entries in red pen. "This is self-dealing," she said. "Nonprofits can't pay board members or their families without full board approval and disclosure. If she didn't get a vote on this, it's fraud." I'd learned enough about nonprofit law during a deployment to Afghanistan where we'd worked with NGOs to know that board members who funnel money to themselves can be removed and sometimes prosecuted, but I needed to verify the rules for Colorado specifically. A quick Google search confirmed what Marlena suspected. Any financial benefit to a board member requires disclosure and a conflict of interest vote by the rest of the board. There was no record of either in the meeting minutes Dale had posted online. The next morning, Marcus caught me at the mailbox and walked over with his hands in his pockets, looking like he had something to say, but wasn't sure how to start. "I've lived here 9 years, Marcus said finally. "Connie's run off 3 families that I know of. Always finds a reason. Noise complaints, property maintenance, whatever. But it's never the white folks, you notice that. He told me she'd filed noise complaints against him for loud music even though he doesn't own speakers, just listens to NPR on a clock radio. She'd called animal control on the Hispanic family, claiming their beagle was a vicious dog that threatened children. She'd reported the veterans' work van as an abandoned vehicle 3 times until the sheriff told her to stop wasting their time. If you're building something to push back, Marcus said, count me in. I'm tired of watching good people leave because one woman thinks she runs the neighborhood. I shook his hand and said, I'll be in touch. Walking back to my house, I could hear Connie's voice drifting from her open window, sharp and angry, talking on the phone to someone about that military troublemaker, and I smiled because I knew she was scared. People like Connie thrive on control, and the moment they feel it slipping, they make mistakes. I was counting on it. I couldn't sleep that night, so around 2 a.m., I found myself at the kitchen table with my laptop, digging through public county records the way I used to dig through intel reports, looking for patterns nobody else had noticed. Property records, tax assessments, court filings, all of it available online if you know where to look and have the patience to wade through bureaucratic database systems designed by people who apparently hate user interfaces. I started with Connie and Garrett's address, pulled up their property record, and sat staring at the screen for a full minute trying to process what I was seeing. $47,000 in unpaid property tax liens going back 2 years, with foreclosure proceedings that had been paused due to a hardship application they'd filed 6 months ago. I cross-referenced with court records and found a malpractice settlement from 8 months earlier where Garrett's law firm had paid out $230,000 to a client they'd screwed over in a real estate deal. And suddenly the whole picture snapped into focus like a surveillance photo coming into resolution. Connie wasn't obsessed with property values because she cared about the neighborhood. She was terrified that her own financial collapse would drag down home prices and expose her as a fraud, and every single complaint she'd filed, every petition she'd circulated, Every meeting she'd called was just her projecting her own failure onto everyone else. It was almost sad, really. The way people in freefall will grab at anything around them and try to drag others down just to feel less alone in their descent. I'd seen it overseas in corrupt officials who'd abused their power right up until the moment everything collapsed. And sitting there in my kitchen with the refrigerator humming in the background and the smell of yesterday's coffee still lingering in the pot, I realized Connie was no different, just operating on a smaller, more pathetic stage. Marlena came downstairs in her bathrobe, poured herself a glass of water, and saw me staring at the laptop screen with that expression she calls my mission face. "You found something," she said, and it wasn't a question. I turned the screen so she could see the tax lien document. "She's broke," I said. "The house is underwater, Garrett's firm is bleeding money, and she's been running a shell game with traffic cones and HOA petitions to distract everyone from the fact that she's about 6 months from losing everything." Marlena read through the documents, and I watched her expression shift from surprise to something that looked almost like pity, which is one of the things I love about my wife. Even when someone's trying to destroy us, she can still see them as human. "Are you going to use this?" she asked. I shook my head. "Not directly, that's too crude, and it makes me look vindictive. But if she's this desperate, she's going to overplay her hand, and when she does, I want to be ready." The truth is, I'd learned in 23 years of military intelligence that the best way to defeat an enemy isn't to attack their weakness directly. It's to give them just enough pressure that they panic and make mistakes while you stand back and document everything they do wrong. Over the next week, I started making small, deliberate moves designed to remind Connie exactly whose property she was staring at every morning. I parked my truck prominently in the driveway every single day, washed and waxed so it gleamed in the sunlight like a monument to the fact that I wasn't going anywhere. I installed a flagpole in my front yard, perfectly within code, exactly 6 feet from the property line, and flew an American flag that I raised at dawn and lowered at dusk with the kind of military precision that turned a simple flag into a statement. I even added a decorative boulder near the property line, one of those big landscaping rocks that costs $300 and requires a small crane to place, positioned so it was perfectly visible from Connie's kitchen window every morning when she drank her coffee and stared at my house like it was a personal insult to her existence. Every single thing I did was completely legal, properly permitted where necessary, and designed to assert one simple fact. This was my property. I'd earned it through decades of service, and no amount of petty harassment was going to move me. Within 3 days, I could see her pacing her driveway on the phone, gesturing wildly, her voice carrying across the street in sharp, angry fragments that I couldn't quite make out but didn't need to because the tone said everything. Marlena watched from our porch one evening while I grilled chicken, the smell of barbecue smoke mixing with the pine-scented evening air, and she said quietly, "You're poking the bear." I flipped a chicken breast and replied, "I'm giving her rope," and we both knew what I meant because desperate people don't de-escalate when they're cornered. They double down, they thrash, they make the kind of mistakes that turn a quiet neighborhood dispute into something you can take to court, and I was counting on every single one of them. 2 days after I installed the flagpole, Marcus showed up at my door with a 6-pack of beer and a grim expression that told me he hadn't come just to be neighborly. We sat on my back porch where Connie couldn't see us, and he got straight to the point. "I talked to Yolanda Sims and Gil Farnsworth," he said, twisting the cap off his beer. "They want in on whatever you're planning because Connie's been after them too." Yolanda was a single mom, elementary school teacher, lived 6 houses down with her daughter, and apparently Connie had reported her backyard trampoline to the county as an unsafe, attractive nuisance that posed a liability risk to the neighborhood, which resulted in a county inspector showing up and scaring Yolanda half to death before clearing the trampoline as perfectly safe. Gil was 71, Korean War veteran, and Connie had tried to force him to remove a memorial flagpole he'd installed to honor his fallen buddies, claiming it violated some imaginary height restriction she'd invented. "So, what's the play?" Marcus asked, and I appreciated that he didn't waste time with small talk or try to convince me to just let it go because he understood the same thing I did. People like Connie don't stop until someone makes them stop. We met at my kitchen table the following Saturday morning, the 4 of us drinking coffee while Marlena took notes on a legal pad and listened to everyone's stories. And what emerged was a pattern so obvious I was surprised nobody had connected the dots before. Connie had been targeting specific people, the ones who didn't fit her vision of what the neighborhood should look like, the ones who worked blue-collar jobs or didn't maintain their lawns to country club standards, the ones whose skin was a little too dark or whose cars were a little too old. and she'd been using the HOA as a weapon to drive them out through exhaustion and frustration. "We're not breaking any rules," I said, spreading out the HOA financial records on the table. "We're using them. Everything by the book, everything documented, everything legal." I showed them what I'd found in the financial records. The $8,400 in vague administrative expenses, the $1,200 paid to Garrett's law firm without proper board approval, and watched their expressions shift from anger to something that looked like hope, because for the first time, they realized this wasn't just about surviving Connie's harassment, but actually holding her accountable. The plan came together over the next hour like a military operation, which makes sense because that's how I'd been trained to think. Identify the objective, assess available resources, execute with precision. First step was filing a formal complaint with the Colorado Secretary of State about the HOA's financial irregularities, and I'd learned from Lynette that any board member of a Colorado nonprofit can be removed for self-dealing, which means paying themselves or their family members without a full board vote and proper disclosure in the meeting minutes. Marcus volunteered to file the complaint, which kept my name off the initial paperwork and made it harder for Connie to claim this was personal retaliation. Second step was requesting a special HOA meeting, which the bylaws allowed if 20% of homeowners petitioned for it, meaning we needed 10 signatures out of 47 homes. We already had 4 people in my kitchen. Gil knew 5 neighbors who couldn't stand Connie, and Yolanda promised to talk to 3 more families on her street who'd been quietly suffering under Connie's reign. Third step was preparing a presentation for that meeting. Just facts, no emotion, no personal attacks, laying out the financial mismanagement and calling for an immediate board recall vote. Fourth step was inviting media, because the local paper, the Pinewood Gazette, loved writing about HOA abuse stories, and Yolanda had a contact there from when they'd covered her school's fundraiser last year. Gil, who'd been quiet through most of the planning, finally spoke up. "You really think this'll work?" he asked, and I could hear the weight in his voice. The exhaustion of a man who'd fought one war overseas and didn't think he'd have to fight another one in his own neighborhood. "It'll work," I said, because people like Connie rely on everyone being too tired or too scared to push back. The moment someone does, the whole thing collapses. Marcus raised his beer. "To collapsing houses of cards," he said, and we all drank to that. After everyone left, Marlena found me standing at the kitchen sink washing the coffee mugs, and she wrapped her arms around me from behind. "Why not just move?" she asked quietly. "We could sell, find somewhere peaceful, start over." I turned to face her. "I spent 20 years in places where warlords controlled people through fear and intimidation," I said. "I'm not letting it happen on my own street." "And our kids are watching. The one at West Point, the one studying engineering. They're watching how we handle bullies, and I want them to see that you don't run, you don't hide, you stand up and you fight back with truth and the law on your side." Marlena kissed my forehead. "Then let's fight," she said. And I knew right then that whatever came next, we'd face it together, the same way we'd faced every deployment, every move, every challenge the Army had thrown at us for 2 decades. The week before the scheduled HOA meeting, I woke up at 5:30 a.m. like always, started the coffee, walked outside to grab the newspaper, and immediately knew something was wrong because my truck was sitting lower than it should have been. All 4 tires slashed, clean cuts through the sidewalls, the kind of damage that's deliberate and personal and costs about $800 to fix. I stood there in my driveway in bare feet and sweatpants, the morning air cold enough that I could see my breath, and felt that old familiar anger rising up. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, calculating kind that comes from years of dealing with threats and knowing exactly how to dismantle them piece by piece. I pulled out my phone, reviewed the security camera footage, and there it was. 2:17 a.m., a figure in a dark hoodie approaching from the street, kneeling by each tire, working quickly, then disappearing back the way they'd come. The footage was clear enough to see the person's height and the way they moved, but the face was obscured and the lighting made it impossible to identify them definitively, which meant whoever did this knew where my cameras were and had planned accordingly. I filed a police report within the hour, and Deputy Krause showed up looking tired and frustrated, like he'd already had a long day, even though it wasn't even 7 a.m. yet. He watched the footage on my laptop, made notes, took photos of the slashed tires, and said what I already knew he'd say. "Height and gait are consistent with your neighbor, but without a clear face shot or other evidence, we can't make charges stick. You need more." I handed him a printed timeline of every incident over the past 4 months. The false police calls, the code enforcement harassment, the hospital complaint against Marlena, the anonymous letter. and watched him flip through it with the expression of someone who's seen this pattern before and knows exactly where it's heading. "Keep this documentation," he said. "If she escalates again, and I think she will, you'll have everything you need for a restraining order at minimum." My insurance covered the tires, but that wasn't the point. The point was that Connie had crossed from harassment into property destruction, which meant she was panicking and making exactly the kind of mistakes I'd been waiting for. I knelt by the truck after Kraus left, running my hand over the slashed rubber, and the smell hit me, hot tire rubber mixed with the metallic tang of cut steel belts, acrid and sharp in the cold morning air, and I thought about all the times I'd dealt with insurgents who'd sabotaged equipment thinking it would break our will, not understanding that every attack just made us more methodical, more patient, more determined to see the mission through. 3 days later, the smear campaign started, and I'll admit I didn't see it coming because I'd underestimated how desperate Connie had become. Someone created a fake Facebook profile called Concerned Pinewood Resident and started posting in the neighborhood group, claiming that a new neighbor was an aggressive military type who threatened families, surveilled children with cameras, and had a history of violent behavior that the community should be aware of. The posts were vague enough to avoid direct libel, but specific enough that everyone knew they were talking about me, and within hours several neighbors had shared the posts before anyone realized the profile was only 3 days old with no real photos or history. Yolanda was the one who caught it first, took screenshots of everything before the posts got deleted, and called me immediately. "Vance, you need to see this," she said, and I could hear the anger in her voice, the kind of protective fury that comes from watching someone you care about get attacked with lies. I read through the screenshots and felt something twist in my chest, not for myself, but for Marlena and my kids, because these weren't just attacks on me. They were attempts to destroy my reputation in a community where reputation is everything, where a rumor can follow you for years and color every interaction you have with neighbors and friends. That evening, my son called from West Point, and I could tell he was trying to sound calm, but there was an edge in his voice. "Dad, someone tagged me in a Facebook post saying you're threatening people in your neighborhood. What's going on?" I explained the situation as clearly as I could, told him about Connie's escalating harassment and the fake profile, and he was quiet for a moment before saying, "You always told me to document everything and let the truth speak for itself. Are you doing that?" I smiled despite everything, because hearing my own advice reflected back at me by a kid who'd grown into a man while I wasn't looking reminded me why this mattered in the first place. "I am," I said, "and when this is over, I'm going to show you exactly how we handled it, because someday you're going to deal with someone like this, and you need to know that you don't fight lies with anger. You fight them with facts and patience and the willingness to let your enemy destroy themselves." After we hung up, I sat in my office, printed out the fake Facebook screenshots, added them to my growing file of evidence, and realized I'd completely stopped reacting emotionally to any of this because it had become just another operation, another mission, another problem to solve with the same tools I'd used for 23 years. The special HOA meeting was in 2 days, and I'd completed my dossier, timeline, photos, financial records, witness statements, everything spiral-bound and ready to distribute. And somewhere across the street, I knew Connie was preparing her own defense, probably printing out her own packets filled with accusations and deflections, not realizing that she'd already lost the moment she'd decided to fight facts with feelings. 3 days before the meeting, Dale sent out an email at 10 p.m. on a Sunday night with the subject line, "Meeting postponed indefinitely," and a single paragraph explaining that due to unforeseen scheduling conflicts and potential legal concerns, the special HOA meeting would need to be rescheduled at a later date to be determined. I read it twice, felt my jaw tighten, and immediately called Dale's cell phone, which rang 6 times before he picked up with a voice that sounded like he'd been dreading this call since the moment he hit send. "Dale, who told you to cancel the meeting?" I asked, keeping my tone level and professional even though I wanted to reach through the phone and shake some backbone into him. There was a long pause, and I could hear his television in the background, some late-night talk show with canned laughter that made the whole conversation feel surreal. "Connie said there were legal concerns," Dale finally stammered. "Garrett reviewed the bylaws and advised that we might be exposing the board to liability if we proceed without proper notice and procedures, and I just thought it would be better to—" I cut him off. "Dale, the bylaws require you to hold a special meeting within 14 days of receiving a valid petition signed by 20% of homeowners. We gave you 11 signatures, which is 23%. If you don't hold this meeting, any homeowner can sue the board for breach of fiduciary duty, and I've got an attorney on standby who'd love to take that case." This was a bluff. I didn't actually have an attorney on standby. But Dale didn't know that, and I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end, probably doing the mental math on how much a lawsuit would cost, versus how much easier it would be to just let the meeting happen. "Fine," he said quietly, defeat heavy in his voice. "Thursday, 7 p.m., Community Center. I'll send out the corrected notice in the morning." Thursday arrived with the kind of nervous energy that reminded me of pre-mission briefings, where everyone knows something significant is about to happen, but nobody's quite sure how it'll unfold. By 6:30 p.m., the community center parking lot was already filling up, and I sat in my truck watching neighbors arrive in clusters, some looking curious, others looking concerned, a few looking downright angry like they'd already picked their side before hearing a single word. 41 of the 47 homeowners had RSVP'd that they planned to attend, which was unprecedented in the neighborhood's history. And as I walked toward the entrance with Marlena beside me and Marcus, Gil, and Yolanda a few steps behind, I could feel the weight of what we were about to do settling over me like the gear you put on before a patrol. Heavy, necessary, and impossible to take off until the job is done. Inside, the room smelled like burnt coffee from the ancient pot someone had started in the corner, mixed with the sharp chemical scent of floor wax that the janitorial service must have applied earlier that day, and the metal folding chairs made small, creaking sounds as people settled into their seats and pulled out their phones to record what they sensed would be worth documenting. Connie had arrived early and set up a table at the front of the room with stacks of her own packets. I could see them from across the room, printed on expensive paper with color-coded tabs, the kind of desperate over-preparation that signals someone who knows they're about to lose but can't stop themselves from fighting anyway. She was wearing a navy blazer and pearls, her hair perfect, her makeup carefully applied, and she kept glancing at the door every time someone new entered like she was counting votes in her head and trying to calculate whether she still had enough support to survive what was coming. Garrett sat beside her, looking uncomfortable in a suit that probably cost more than my truck payment, scrolling through his phone with the studied disinterest of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Deputy Krause was there too, standing in the back corner in uniform because I'd requested a sheriff's presence for security, which was code for "I want an official witness to everything that happens tonight," and he gave me a small nod when our eyes met. Jenna Carlson from the Pinewood Gazette sat in the back row with a notepad and a digital recorder on the chair beside her, and I knew that whatever happened in the next hour would be in print by Sunday morning, which meant Connie couldn't control the narrative anymore, couldn't spin this as a personal vendetta or a misunderstanding, couldn't hide behind vague accusations and social media posts that disappeared after someone reported them. Dale called the meeting to order with a trembling hand on the gavel, and you could feel the room hold its breath as he read through the procedural requirements in a monotone voice that suggested he'd been practicing this for days, and still wasn't confident he'd get through it without his voice cracking. This special meeting has been called pursuant to Article 7, Section 3 of the HOA bylaws to address concerns raised by multiple homeowners regarding board governance and financial management, Dale said, then cleared his throat and looked directly at Connie with something that might have been an apology in his eyes. "Miss Riddell, as the petitioner who called for enforcement actions, you have the floor first to present your position." Connie stood, smoothed her blazer, and launched into a prepared statement about volunteer board members who work tirelessly for the community only to be attacked by newcomers who don't understand the neighborhood's values. And I watched her perform with a kind of detached fascination, the same way I'd watched enemy combatants try to justify their actions during interrogations, not realizing that every word they spoke just gave us more evidence to use against them. The room was silent except for her voice and the sound of people shifting in their chairs, and I knew that in about 5 minutes, everything was going to change. Marcus stood up from his seat in the middle row before Connie had even finished her second paragraph, and his voice cut through the room with the kind of authority that comes from years of dealing with difficult people on mail routes and knowing exactly when someone's trying to sell you bullshit. "Point of order," Marcus said loudly. "She's lying, and everyone in this room knows it." The room erupted in scattered gasps and murmurs, and Dale banged his gavel twice, looking panicked, but Connie's face went pale and then red in the span of about 3 seconds, and I could see her hands shaking as she gripped the edges of the podium. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice rising to that pitch that happens when someone's losing control. "I am a volunteer board member who has dedicated—" Marcus cut her off. "You've dedicated 4 years to harassing people who don't fit your idea of what this neighborhood should look like, and we're done pretending otherwise." Dale looked at me helplessly, and I stood up, calm and deliberate, and said, "Mr. Hartwick, you called this meeting, so you have the floor." I walked to the front of the room carrying a cardboard box filled with spiral-bound dossiers, and I started handing them out row by row while the room watched in complete silence. broken only by the sound of pages being flipped and the occasional whispered, "Oh my God," as people started reading. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Vance Hartwick, U.S. Army Reserve," I said, standing at the front with my hands at my sides in that relaxed parade rest posture that's become automatic after 2 decades in uniform. "I've spent 23 years serving this country, and I moved to Pinewood Estates 8 months ago because I wanted peace and quiet after spending most of my adult life in war zones. Instead, I've been systematically harassed, my wife's career has been threatened, and my property has been vandalized, all because one person decided that my truck and my job didn't meet her standards." I clicked the remote in my hand and the projector screen behind me lit up with the first slide. A timeline starting with Connie's welcome packet and the highlighted vehicle restriction, running through the false police calls, the code enforcement complaints, the anonymous letter, the hospital report about Marlena, and ending with photos of my slashed tires from last week. "This isn't about community standards," I said, advancing to the next slide showing the fake Facebook posts. "This is about abuse of power." The room was dead silent now, everyone reading their dossiers and looking up at the screen, and then looking at Connie, whose face had gone from red to white, and whose hands were now gripping Garrett's arm like she might fall over without support. I advanced to the financial records slide, the one showing $8,400 in unexplained administrative expenses, and the $1,200 payment to Garrett's law firm. "The HOA bylaws require board members to disclose any payments to family members and get a conflict of interest vote from the full board," I said. "According to the meeting minutes posted online, no such vote ever occurred, which means Miss Riddell has been funneling association funds to her husband's failing law firm without authorization." Connie's voice cracked when she tried to respond. "This is slander! Garrett, do something!" But Garrett just sat there looking at his phone, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and resigned. "Connie, stop talking. Please just stop talking." The room erupted in whispers and conversations, and I could see people flipping through the dossiers, comparing what they were reading to the slides on the screen, putting together the pieces of a puzzle that had been obvious to anyone paying attention, but that nobody had bothered to assemble until now. I held up my hand and the room quieted down again. "I filed a formal complaint with the Colorado Secretary of State's nonprofit division this morning," I said. "They'll be conducting an audit of the HOA's finances, and if they find what I think they'll find, there will be consequences. But that's not why we're here tonight." I turned to face the room instead of Connie. "We're here because you elected a board to serve this community, and instead, they've been serving themselves and using HOA rules as weapons against anyone they don't like. Marcus has been harassed. Gil has been harassed. Yolanda has been harassed. The Montoya family down on Spruce Street has been harassed. And it stops tonight." I paused. "I move for an immediate recall vote of the entire board, effective immediately, with new elections to be held within 30 days. A woman in the third row I'd never met before raised her hand. "I second that motion." Dale looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, but he went through the procedures mechanically, called for discussion, and when nobody spoke, he called for the vote. "All in favor of recalling the current board?" 38 hands went up. Connie stood abruptly, grabbed her purse, and walked toward the door with Garrett following behind her, and the sound of the metal door slamming echoed through the community center like a gavel striking wood, final and irreversible. After the meeting ended and people started filtering out into the parking lot, Jenna Carlson caught me by my truck and asked if I had a minute for a quick interview. "What do you want people to know about what happened here tonight?" she asked, her recorder held up between us. I thought about it for a second. "HOAs aren't inherently bad," I said. "They serve a purpose. But unchecked power corrupts. And when board members start using their position to settle personal scores instead of serving the community, homeowners need to get involved, ask questions, and demand transparency." She asked about my military background and whether that played a role in how I handled the situation, and I shook my head. "This isn't about rank or training. It's about doing what's right and not backing down when someone tries to bully you into silence. Anyone could have done what I did. They just needed to be willing to put in the work and trust that the truth matters." Jenna snapped a photo of me standing with Marlena, Marcus, Gil, and Yolanda in the parking lot under the streetlights, all of us tired but smiling, and I knew that photo would run on the front page of the local section. And I hoped it would inspire at least one person dealing with their own petty tyrant to stand up and fight back. The new board was elected the following week, and I watched from my porch as neighbors I'd barely spoken to before showed up at the community center to cast their votes in an election that actually mattered for once. Marcus won the presidency with 42 votes. Yolanda became treasurer. and Gil took the secretary position, which meant the three people who'd been targeted most by Connie's harassment were now the ones running the organization she'd used as a weapon for 4 years. I declined when they asked me to join, told them I was just a homeowner who wanted to be left alone to drink coffee on my porch and watch the sunrise without drama, and Marcus laughed and said that was exactly why they'd wanted me, but he understood. The state audit came back 3 weeks later confirming everything I'd documented: $8,400 in improperly documented expenses, $1,200 in unauthorized payments to a board member's family, and a recommendation that the previous board members reimburse the association and that the case be referred to local prosecutors for review of potential fraud charges. Connie and Garrett quietly listed their house for sale 2 days after the audit report went public, and they were gone within 60 days, selling for $30,000 under asking price just to get out fast before the foreclosure proceedings resumed. I never pressed charges for the slashed tires or the harassment, didn't see the point in dragging it out when the whole thing was already over. But Deputy Krause told me later that just having the official reports on file had probably prevented Connie from pulling the same stunts in whatever neighborhood she moved to next, because any future employer or HOA board doing a background check would find a very clear pattern of behavior. The new board's first act was to dissolve the voluntary fines Connie had been pushing for and redirect the HOA's energy toward actual community building. Quarterly barbecues, a holiday lights contest that didn't involve judging or prizes but just celebrating everyone's effort, and a real neighborhood watch program focused on actual safety instead of surveilling people's landscaping choices. Marcus proposed creating the Pinewood Unity Scholarship, $500 a year for a local high school student pursuing public service careers like teaching, nursing, military service, or social work. And the first fundraiser was a pancake breakfast that drew 43 families and raised $2,100 in a single morning. I found myself standing at a griddle flipping pancakes while Marlena poured coffee and kids played soccer in the field behind the community center, and the smell of buttermilk batter and maple syrup mixed with the sound of laughter and the steady thump of a soccer ball being kicked around. And for the first time since we'd moved to Pinewood Estates, it actually felt like a community instead of a battlefield. Yolanda's daughter ended up winning the scholarship 2 years later when she graduated and enrolled in nursing school, and watching Yolanda cry happy tears at the award ceremony reminded me why all of this had mattered in the first place. Not because I needed to win some fight with a petty tyrant, but because good people deserve to live without fear in their own neighborhoods. 6 months after everything settled down, my son graduated from West Point, and at the ceremony, he pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. "Dad, remember when Connie was posting those things about you online and I called worried? You told me that courage isn't loud, it's methodical and patient and lets the truth do the talking. I think about that every day now." That might have been the proudest moment of my life, knowing that dealing with a nightmare neighbor had somehow taught my kid a lesson about integrity that he'd carry into his career as an officer. We hosted a dinner at our house after graduation, Marlena's cooking, our daughter home from college, and we invited Marcus and his family, Gil, Yolanda, and her daughter, and even the new neighbors who'd bought Connie's old house, a young couple with a baby who seemed genuinely nice and had already asked if they could join the neighborhood watch. My truck sat in the driveway, washed and waxed, and nobody said a word about it because it wasn't a problem anymore. It was just a truck, and that's exactly how it should have been from the beginning. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and Marlena and I were cleaning up the kitchen together, she asked if I'd really meant what I told the newspaper about anyone being able to do what I did, and I thought about it while drying a plate. "Yeah," I said. "The only special thing I brought to this situation was stubbornness and a filing system. Everything else, the public records, the bylaws, the documentation, that's all available to anyone willing to do the homework." She smiled and kissed my cheek. "You know Gil's neighbor 2 streets over is dealing with something similar now? Developer trying to use eminent domain to force him off his land for a strip mall project?" I raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" I said. And Marlena laughed because she knew that tone, knew I was already mentally reviewing what I knew about eminent domain law and thinking about who I could call for information. "You can't help yourself, can you?" she said. I shrugged. Somebody's got to stand up to bullies. Might as well be someone who knows how. So if you're dealing with your own HOA nightmare right now, the board member who thinks they run the neighborhood, the busybody who files complaints about everything you do, the petty tyrant who uses rules as weapons, drop your story in the comments below. The worst one gets featured in next week's video, and maybe we can help you find a solution, because nobody should have to live in fear in their own home. And if you love watching bullies get outsmarted by people who refuse to back down, hit that subscribe button, because I've got more stories like this coming every Tuesday. Remember, quiet professionalism beats loud tyranny every single time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.